Welcome to St. Gabriel Unitarian Universalist Fellowship, a congregation that welcomes all, promotes personal and spiritual growth, and works for a just, peaceful, and sustainable world. Our service today will include a reprise of an earlier talk I gave on reparations for descendants of African Americans enslaved in the U.S. What sparked my interest in reparations was a panel I attended at the 2020 UUA General Assembly, where I learned about the history of and current legislation for reparations. You may recall that H.R. 40, which is a reference to 40 acres and a mule, is a bill in the U.S. House called Commission to Study and Develop Reparation Proposals for African Americans Act. H.R. 40 would establish a federal commission to study the legacy of slavery in this country, as well as its ongoing harm, and develop proposals for redress and repair, including reparations. H.R. 40 is sponsored by Representative Sheila Jackson Lee from Texas. SB 1083 is a companion bill on reparations in the U.S. Senate that is sponsored by Cory Booker. In February of this year, President Biden indicated his support for both of these bills. On April 14th, so just recently, H.R. 40 was passed out of committee in the House of Representatives, which is the first time this has happened since the bill was first introduced in 1989. While this is a small step, it is an indication of growing support among legislators and the public for reparations. We have seen other recent steps on the state and local level. Last year, California established its own commission at the state level to study and recommend reparations for Black Californians. In March this year, the City Council of Evanston, Illinois approved the first reparations program for Black people in the United States. And there have been other reparations efforts recently in many communities, including Providence, Rhode Island, Asheville, North Carolina, and Burlington, Vermont, as well as Amherst, Massachusetts. Business and religious organizations are also acknowledging their roles in slavery and taking steps to address its continuing harm. Next month at the UUA General Assembly, our national annual conference, there again will be a panel on reparations. The speakers will explore the basis for reparations to African Americans and Indigenous peoples and outline actions we can take nationally, locally, and in our own UU churches. The panel on reparations is on Friday, June 25th at the General Assembly. So let me talk a little bit about General Assembly, or GA as we call it. As it was last year, GA this year will be held virtually, so it will be easy for any of us to attend. The whole online GA service will be June 23 through 27. Last year, several of us from St. Gabriel attended GA virtually, and we were part of a record-breaking 4,900 attendees at General Assembly. This year, more than 5,000 attendees are expected. I hope that many of you will be able to attend as well this year. The panels, speakers, worship services, and music are absolutely amazing. I still remember some of the music pieces from last year. Registration is $200 per person, and financial support and a payment plan are available. I also want to mention that the speakers this year for the Ware Lecture, which is a distinguished speaker series at the GA, which started in 1922. This year's Ware Lecturers are Stacey Abrams and Desmond Meade, two leaders in the effort to recognize or to organize for full voting rights in the United States. You're, I'm sure, familiar with the work that Stacey Abrams did in Georgia, and Desmond Meade was very active in registration rights in Florida. The Ware Lecture will be on Saturday, June 26th at 6 p.m. as part of the virtual VA. And to find out more about General Assembly and to register, visit uua.org/GA.
Howdy, St. Gabriel. It's good to be seen again. Today I wanted to do some traditional folk activism songs. Activism is a big part of what it is to be a Unitarian Universalist, and we've had a lot of it lately. And frankly, we're going to keep going. There's a lot left to do. I wanted to sing these songs to remind everybody that we're part of a rich tradition of people who have been continuously fighting for change since this country's inception. I hope you enjoy. As I went walking that ribbon of highway, I saw above me that endless skyway. I saw below me the golden valley, and this land was made for you and me. I roamed and rambled, I followed my footsteps to the sparkling sands of her diamond deserts. And all around me a voice was sounding, this land was made for you and me. This land is your land, this land is my land. From California to the New York Islands, from the redwood forest to the Gulf Stream waters, this land was made for you and me. When the sun comes shining and I was strolling, the wheat fields waving, the dust clouds rolling, a voice was chanting, fog was lifting, this land was made for you and me. There was a wall there, it tried to stop me, the sign was painted, said private property, but on the other side it didn't say nothing. That side was made for you and me. This land is your land, this land is my land. From California to the New York Islands, from the redwood forest to the Gulf Stream waters, this land was made for you and me. This land is your land, this land is my land. From California to the New York Islands, from the redwood forest to the Gulf Stream waters, this land was made for you and me. This land was made for all of us, for you and me.
Good morning. My name is Colleen Sigley, and today's Chalice Lighting is by Jamie Yandel. We light this flame to ignite the sacred power of justice. We light this flame so that it may be a beacon of hope in moments of uncertainty, fear, anxiety, and the unknown. We light this flame and are emboldened by its blaze, knowing that our strength as a prophetic and powerful people is rooted in the diverse ways we answer the call to love.
The opening words are by Lynn Cox. Spirit of life and love, known by many names and yet fully known by none, we give thanks for this time and place of renewal. Grant us courage to continue on the journey, the courage to speak up for the well-being of others and ourselves and the planet. May we forgive each other when our courage falls short, and may we try again. Grant us hearts to love boldly, to embody our faith and our values in living words and deeds. May our hearts be open to embrace humility, grace, and reconciliation. Grant us the ability to learn and grow, to let the spirit of love and truth work its transformation upon us and within us. Grant us the spirit of hospitality, the willingness to sustain a fit dwelling place for the holy that resides in all being. Grant us a sense of peace in the world, even as we are in motion. Let us cultivate together the strength to welcome every kind of gift and all manner of ways to be on the journey together. To this we add the silent prayers of our hearts.
Hello, my name is Jerry Covey. Please join as we read in unison the words of our affirmation. The doctrine of this church is love. The quest of truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge in freedom, to serve humanity in fellowship, to the end that all souls shall grow in harmony with the divine. Thus do we covenant with each other.
Thank you, Keith, and good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to be with you, and I really enjoyed brainstorming with Keith for a Wonderbox story that will help complement his topic and thoughts today. And I'm happy that I have this at-home Wonderbox as well, because what I want to share with you in here is a little bit bigger than the normal Wonderbox. So I'm glad I have this option. So let's use our wondering minds, which, as our fourth principle states, helps us as you use to learn and grow together. We're always searching for the truth and looking for new ways to navigate our world. So what could be in here? I've said it was fairly large, but you can't hear anything. Do you want to tell a friend, someone near you, what you think might be in here? Let's open it up and see. And it's a pillow. This little pillow was made for me by my grandmother. And while I don't really use it as a pillow for my head, I do keep it on my bed. And the reason I want to share it with you today is because the story that we're about to read has to do with our homes. And I feel like everyone needs a place to rest their head, and everyone deserves a good night's sleep. So let's get to that story. It's called The Lumberjack's Beard by Duncan Beatty. Big Jim Hickory was a lumberjack. He lived by the forest in a little log cabin. He had burly shoulders and a big, bristly beard. Every morning he did limbering up exercises. It's very important to limber up if you're a lumberjack. After a hearty breakfast of pancakes and maple syrup, Jim slung his trusty axe over his burly shoulder and headed out into the forest. Chop, choppity chop went Jim's axe, echoing through the valley as he felled tree after tree. After a long day of swinging, whacking, cleaving, and hacking, Jim headed back to his cabin. That evening, when he was just about to go to bed, he heard a peck-peckety-peck at the door. Jim looked down to see a small and very angry bird. "I had just built a new nest in my tree," shrieked the bird, "and you chopped it down." Jim scratched his head. Then he had an idea. "I suppose you could move into my beard," he said. "Very well then," said the bird, and in it flew. The next morning, Jim woke up earlier than usual due to the birds chirping at the crack of dawn. He did his limbering up exercises, got dressed, and ate his breakfast, with a little help from the new tenant in his beard. Jim's next job was to strip all the branches and leaves from the tree trunks and burn them in a big bonfire. After a long day of chopping, snapping, burning, and crackling, Jim trudged back to his cabin for a well-earned rest. No sooner had he put his axe away than he heard a noise at the door. Scratch, scratchity, scratch. He looked down to see a very angry porcupine. "I needed those leaves and pine needles to make a cozy shelter, but you burned them. Where am I going to live now?" snapped the porcupine. Jim thought and scratched his chin. "Well," he said, "I suppose you could move into my beard." He bent down and the porcupine crawled in. The next morning, Jim woke up even earlier and attempted to do his limbering up exercises. He looked in the mirror and scratched his chin. Yow! He got porcupine quills in his fingers. He tried to eat his breakfast, but lost his appetite when he noticed bird poop on his shirt. Jim's job that day was to float all the tree trunks down the river to the lumberyard. One by one, he rolled the logs into the fast-flowing water. After a hard day of lugging, splashing, rolling, and crashing, Jim staggered back to his cabin. Thwump, thwump, thwump went his door. He looked down to see a very angry beaver on his doorstep. "I spent all day building my dam and it got smashed to bits by those logs you threw in the river," it snarled. Without a word, Jim picked up the beaver and put it in his beard. Between the chirping, the porcupine's prickling, and the beaver's thwumping, Jim didn't get much sleep that night. He was too tired to do his limbering up exercises in the morning, and the beaver's thwumping tail knocked his pancakes all over the floor. "That's it," cried Jim. "I can't take it anymore. You all have to move out today." "But where will we live?" cried the animals. As Jim scratched his chin, he had a brilliant idea. He went into his bathroom, took out his razor, and began to shave off his big, bristly beard. Then he took the hair and piled it up on his porch, and the bird, the porcupine, and the beaver all moved in to their new bristly den. That night, Jim slept better than he had for some time. He woke up and did some particularly vigorous limbering up exercises and put on a fresh plaid shirt. Then he made an enormous tower of pancakes and maple syrup. Jim looked out at the window at the bare ground where the forest used to be and scratched his now stubbly chin. Then he had another brilliant idea. Jim took his shovel and dug hole after hole and planted tree after tree. Jim's beard grew back over time. The trees took quite a bit longer, but it was worth the wait. The end. I really like this story because the lumberjack realizes his responsibility to the forest animals. He comes up with a solution at first that wound up not really working very well for anyone, but he kept at it. He realized he'd made some mistakes. It can be hard to make a mistake and admit when we are wrong. And it can be hard to make up for that mistake, to try to fix it. But our UU faith and our covenant with one another calls us to do that work. We'll talk more about that at RE time today. I'll see you then. Bye.
There's something happening here. But what it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there telling me I got to beware. Think it's time we stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. right if everybody's wrong. Young people speaking their minds, facing so much resistance from behind. It's time we stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. What a field day for the heat. 1,000 people in the streets, singing songs and carrying signs, mostly saying hooray for our side. It's time we stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. Deep into your life, it will creep. It starts when you're always afraid. Step out of line and they'll come and take you away. It's time we stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. Stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. Stop. What's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.
My name is Keith Hutchinson, and I've been a member of San Gabriel UU with my wife Dana since 2014. When I was a skinny 17-year-old in high school, I got to play the role of Tevye in a high school musical production of Fiddler on the Roof. I wore a costume with a big stuffed belly and a bushy beard glued on my face. And I got to sing If I Were a Rich Man and Sunrise Sunset for 3 performances. For me, Fiddler on the Roof was an introduction to the Jewish faith and traditions, and so playing that role led to a lifelong interest in Judaism. This is the time of year when we approach the high holidays of Rosh Hashana, the Jewish New Year, and Yom Kippur. Rosh Hashana, which starts on Friday, September 18th, is celebrated with the lighting of candles, sharing of meals, and blowing of a shofar or ram's horn. The 10 days from Rosh Hashana through Yom Kippur are to be a period of reflection. Yom Kippur is on September 27th this year, and it's considered the holiest day of the Jewish year. Yom Kippur means Day of Atonement. For the devout, Yom Kippur can include a 25-hour fast, a service at the synagogue, and prohibitions on work. The focus of the holiday is to reflect on sins of the past year and seek redemption. To atone for our mistakes is not only to acknowledge our sins, but to make amends or seek repairs for the wrongs we have committed. It is interesting to look at the word atonement and break it down into its 3 syllables, at, one, ment. This implies a sort of transformational process by which the pieces that are separate or broken within us can be melded back together, and we can become whole. By accounting for our sins, reflecting on them, and then seeking to make amends or repair those wrongs, we can fix our relations with others and thereby repair our own souls to achieve at-one-ment again. Now, as Unitarians, we do not often speak in terms of personal sins or souls or talk much about the need for seeking redemption. At least this is not the language we usually use. In the story about the lumberjack that Karina shared with us, the lumberjack came to realize that he had harmed the animals by taking away their homes. His first attempts to address the problem didn't work very well, not for him or the animals. But when he took a more expansive view of what he had done, he engaged in a program to repair the forest he had cut down and replanted the trees and restored the animals' homes. As UUs, we do have a tradition of talking about collective wrongs, of learning about past injustices, and working through social justice action to make repairs for those wrongs. In that regard, if we think about atonement in terms of collective wrongs of our society, then at this moment, an acknowledgement and atonement for the past and ongoing wrongs of white supremacy and racism is fitting and long overdue. The killing of George Floyd on May 25th by a Minneapolis police officer sparked a level of collective outrage and protest we have not seen in some time. The murder of a black person by police, one of many in recent years, unfortunately, and the month since, has forced us to recognize and confront patterns of racism that unfortunately are enmeshed in our society. If we are to take stock of and then try to repair the wrongs of slavery, white supremacy, and discrimination, then we need to undertake an accounting of the scope and breadth of the wrongs. To be aware of and address the ways in which racism is institutionalized, we have to do more than just ask white people to be nice and require diversity training, although those things are necessary as well. If white people want to atone for these sins, then we need to understand the contours of racism and its political and economic dimensions. This is the starting point, then, for the movement for reparations for Black Americans. A bill in the U.S. House to impanel a commission to study reparations, which we will come back to later, starts with this accounting of the impact of slavery and its ongoing effects. Let's look first at political wrongs. From 1619, when slavery was first established in the colonies, and for nearly 250 years until the Emancipation Proclamation was signed in 1863, African Americans were treated as property, not human beings. Slaves were bought and sold, families were split up, children were separated from their parents. African Americans held as slaves were not permitted to read, were often beaten and tortured. From 1863 to 1964, with the passage of the Voting Rights Act, a period of 101 years, many African Americans still could not vote or participate in the political process due to poll taxes or literacy tests. Between the Civil War and 1950, an estimated 6,500 African Americans were lynched by the Ku Klux Klan and other hate groups. One reason for this terror to enforce white supremacy was to keep back Black Americans from voting and participating in the political process. Consider that in the 401 years from 1619 to 1920, basically the period that slaves were introduced to the present day, African Americans have had the right to participate as full citizens, more or less, for only the last 56 years, which is 14% of that total time. How do we measure the cost of 86% of our shared history in which African Americans were considered property or could not participate as full citizens in our political process? Of course, political gerrymandering and vote suppression continue to this day. Even this year, we see limited polling places in our cities, onerous voter registration and vote by mail requirements, and voter ID laws, all being used to suppress the vote of African Americans and other persons of color. Then let's consider economic and monetary wrongs. What is the amount if we tally all the wages that were not paid to millions of Black Americans in the 250 years of slavery? What would that amount be? Then, in the post-Civil War, in the Jim Crow period of 100 more years, what is the total amount of theft in the form of occupational discrimination, lack of opportunity to go to college, and systems of organized robbery like the sharecropper system that kept Black Americans in poverty or forced them to sell their land? The New Deal legislation of the 1930s provided a lifeline for many during the Great Depression. However, when President Roosevelt signed Social Security into law in 1935, 65% of African Americans nationally and between 70 and 80% in the South were ineligible. That's in part because farm workers and those who worked as domestics, professions with large numbers of Black Americans, were excluded from Social Security. At the time of Social Security passing, the NAACP protested the law, calling the new American safety net a sieve with holes just big enough for the majority of Negroes to fall through. But we don't have to look that far back to see the practice and legacy of institutions that, because of discrimination based on race, robbed Black Americans to the benefit of whites. The GI Bill, passed after World War II to help veterans with federally backed housing loans and college tuition, helped many enter the working class with a house in the suburbs. But because of the practice of race-based discrimination in home lending, and at the time, many Black Americans were not able to get financing for a home. Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote an influential article in the Atlantic magazine in 2014 called The Case for Reparations. In it, he explains the practice of home loan discrimination known as redlining and its effects. The Federal Housing Authority, says Coates, had adopted a system of maps that rated neighborhoods according to their perceived stability. On the maps, green areas, marked as A, indicated in-demand neighborhoods that, as one appraiser put it, lacked a single foreigner or Negro. These neighborhoods were considered excellent prospects for insurance. Neighborhoods where Black people lived were rated D, and usually were considered ineligible for FHA backing. They were colored in red. Redlining went beyond FHA-backed loans and spread to the entire mortgage industry, excluding Black people from most legitimate means of obtaining a mortgage. So what was the cost and legacy of these discriminatory loan practices that kept Black Americans from buying a home? Richard Rothstein, in the book The Color of Law from 2017, provides one example from Levittown, New York, one of the first planned community suburbs built in 1947 and 1948, the post-World War II era. The deeds on those homes actually prohibited their sale to Black Americans. The federal loans, these were federal loans for the homes in Levittown, required that they be sold only to white families, and that the homes in those suburbs had deeds that prohibited resale even to African Americans. Those homes sold for about $8,000 or about $100,000 in current money. Today, though, those homes sell for $300,000 to $400,000. They're no longer affordable to working class families. In the ensuing 2 generations since they were built, the white families who moved into those homes or gave them to their children gained that $200,000 to $300,000 in equity appreciation. African Americans, on the other hand, living in rented apartments, prohibited from moving to the suburbs, gained none of that appreciation or none of that wealth. The result is that today, nationwide, African American incomes on average are 60% of white incomes. which is bad enough. But African American wealth is 5 to 7% of white wealth. Let me say that again. African American wealth is 5 to 7% of white wealth. That enormous difference is almost entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy practiced in the mid-20th century. Whites were able to pass on the wealth from their home equity to their children in the form of a college education or a down payment on a home. But many black families were prevented from acquiring and passing along wealth to their children. This is one concrete way that racism has resulted in ongoing, institutional, economic harm created by government policy. So we've considered the political harms of slavery and discrimination, as well as some of the economic harms or wrongs. And we could go on to account for and measure harms that are social, psychological, and spiritual. Many of those wrongs or sins continue to the present day. This is the kind of accounting or reckoning that is envisioned by the movement for reparations and the kind that they call us to begin. This is the first step in reparations, which is simply to try and understand and measure the harms caused by slavery and the decades of discrimination that have followed, harms that often are not spoken of or not included in the history books. Reparations for former slaves and their descendants is not a new idea. In 1865, U.S. General William Sherman issued Special Order No. 15, which redistributed 400,000 acres of formerly Confederate-owned coastal land in South Carolina and Florida and subdivided it into 40-acre plots and gave it to former slaves. That was the order, and this was the initial 40 acres and a mule promised to black Americans freed from slavery. That promise, of course, was shortly overturned by former slave owner and President Andrew Johnson, our first president to be impeached. The unfulfilled promise of 40 acres is a reference point in H.R. 40. That's the bill for reparations, first introduced by Michigan Congressman John Conyers in 1989. H.R. 40 has been introduced to the House every year since 1989, but has never been brought to the House floor for a vote. The Commission to Study and Develop Reparation Proposals for African Americans Act, as it is formally titled, was reintroduced in 2018 by Representative Sheila Jackson Lee from Houston as its first sponsor. The bill now has 154 co-sponsors. And in 2019, Senator Cory Booker introduced Senate Bill 1083, a companion bill on reparations to H.R. 40 in the U.S., and that was introduced in the U.S. Senate. Senators Kamala Harris, Amy Klobuchar, Kirsten Gillibrand, Bernie Sanders, and Elizabeth Warren, all presidential candidates, have all co-sponsored the bill as well. Last year on Juneteenth, hearings on reparations were held before the House Judiciary Committee, at which Senator Booker, Ta-Nehisi Coates, Danny Glover, and others testified. What would these bills do, these bills for Senate for reparations? H.R. 40, the House bill, would establish a commission to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. The commission would examine slavery and discrimination in the colonies and the United States from 1619 to the present, and recommend appropriate remedies. The bill would not require that one dime actually be paid in reparations. That will require further action. In speaking of the bill, Congresswoman Lee has said that the reparations movement does not focus on payments to individuals, but remedies that can be created in as many forms necessary to equitably address the many kinds of injuries sustained from chattel slavery and its continuing vestiges. Other advocates for reparations, like Coates, do not rule out payments to individuals. Coates points out that Germany in 1952 began payments to the State of Israel, as well as individual survivors of the Holocaust. These payments have totaled more than $89 billion. And reparations in the United States are not without precedent. More than 100,000 Americans of Japanese descent who were imprisoned in camps during World War II were each paid $20,000 under a law signed in 1988 by Ronald Reagan. There also is precedent for Unitarian Universalists paying reparations. Many of us, I'm sure, have heard about the 1921 Tulsa race massacre, in which a white mob killed some 300 black Americans in Tulsa and destroyed 1,265 homes and 150 businesses in what was known as the Black Wall Street, as well as hospitals, churches, and schools, all in the city of Tulsa. At the 2001 UUA General Assembly, delegates approved in an action of immediate witness for reparations to be paid to the 130 remaining survivors of that massacre in Tulsa. Funded by UU congregations in Tulsa and the UUA, quarterly payments were made directly to survivors. In addition to payments to individuals, other forms of reparations have been proposed, such as investments in schools and universities and college scholarships. Another proposal, called baby bonds, would create a program to provide a trust fund similar to Social Security for babies in disadvantaged families. A publicly funded trust fund for children in the least wealthy households would provide a foundation for economic security for every poor child in the U.S. These ideas for reparations are the kinds of proposals to be offered, developed, and debated as envisioned in the U.S. House and Senate bills. I believe that UUs, because of our principles, should support H.R. 40 and SB 1083 to study reparations. So how could we, as UUs, work on a national level, or here at St. Gabriel UU, or even in our personal lives on this issue of reparations? One step we could take would be to work with other UUs and the UU Association to support a resolution at the next General Assembly in support of H.R. 40 and reparations. We could advocate a study topic to learn more about the history of theft from Black Americans and the ways to redress that injustice. I participated in a well-attended session at the General Assembly in June on reparations. This was the virtual General Assembly that many of us attended. So there is interest in this issue among UUs nationally. I think there was almost 300 people in attendance at that session, showing a lot of interest. We could also do more to learn how slavery and discrimination are linked to the history of Unitarian and Universalist churches in the U.S. Yes, there are many examples of those in our faith tradition who helped to abolish slavery and worked for civil rights for Black Americans. But what past wrongs have been forgotten or need to be accounted for in our own faith tradition? That is part of the work of reparations. We can do that in our personal lives as well. My dad, Bill, was in the Navy during the Korean War, and after he served, he went back to Iowa, where he grew up. He went to college on the GI Bill at the University of Iowa, and then he got married and moved to Illinois. And I was born and grew up in Elk Grove Village, a suburb of Chicago. Our neighborhood and my classmates in school were almost totally white. You could count the number of non-white people on one hand in my schools. Our school district was also well-funded, and my teachers were well-paid, among the most well-paid in the state. How did I benefit, then, from redlining and other discriminatory federal policies? What advantages did I have that were not available to children who live 20 miles away in the poor Black neighborhoods in Chicago, those neighborhoods that were redlined? So there is much that we can do on a national level as UUs, here in our congregation, and in our personal lives to account fully for the wrongs of slavery and the history of discrimination. And in thinking about what we might do, I want to return to the idea of atonement. When we atone, we begin to take account of our past wrongs. We have to fully describe and acknowledge the past sins or wrongs, and then we can seek ways to make amends or repairs. The primary reason we seek to atone is not to fix or repair someone else. It is to fix the brokenness within us. I believe that white people who have benefited from the history of slavery and discrimination in this country need to engage in this process of reparations to fix ourselves. We need to address the political, economic, and moral debts we owe in order to work towards becoming whole ourselves again. And now I invite all of you to join in our closing song, We Are.
The chalice extinguishing words were written by Jonah Johnstone. We shall overcome. When we can truly celebrate the diversity of contributions and talents offered by all people, we shall overcome hatred and prejudice and oppression. When we can truly extend our hands to one another in loving acceptance, we shall overcome the past that haunts us now. Living in peace and freedom, we shall overcome the wrongs that have happened and the debts left unpaid. Let us join together in that commitment to overcome. Let us say together, Amen. Amen.
Our closing words are by Ta-Nehisi Coates. Reparations, by which I mean the full acceptance of our collective biography and its consequences, is the price we must pay to see ourselves squarely. The recovering alcoholic may well have to live with his illness for the rest of his life, but at least he is not living a drunken lie. The wealth gap merely puts a number on something we feel but cannot say, that American prosperity was ill-gotten and selective in its distribution. What is needed is an airing of family secrets, a settling with old ghosts. What is needed is a healing of the American psyche and the banishment of white guilt. What I'm talking about is more than recompense for past injustices, more than a handout, a payoff, hush money, or a reluctant bribe. What I'm talking about is a national reckoning that would lead to a spiritual renewal. Reparations would mean the end of scarfing hot dogs on the 4th of July while denying the facts of our heritage. Reparations would mean the end of yelling patriotism while waving a Confederate flag. Reparations would mean a revolution of American consciousness, a reconciling of our self-image as the great democratizer with the facts of our history.
We shall overcome, we shall overcome, we shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe that we shall overcome someday. We'll walk hand in hand, we'll walk hand in hand, we'll walk hand in hand someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe that we'll walk hand in hand someday. We shall all be free, we shall all be free, we shall all be free someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe that we shall all be free someday. We are not afraid, we are not afraid, we are not afraid today. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday. Whole wide world around, whole wide world around, whole wide world around someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe that we shall overcome someday. We shall overcome, we shall overcome, we shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe that we shall overcome